This is the Cedar Creek Church Living It Out podcast, a midweek reminder where we discuss key takeaways and principles from the weekend message to help you live out the truth that you matter.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Living It Out podcast, a weekly podcast to remind you that you matter and to help you live out that truth throughout the week. My name is Casey Greenewalt, and I'm your host today, and I'm joined, as always, with Marna Ward and Ben Bockert. And we're in a series in the church right now called Where's Norm? It's been a super fun series because right now we are all faced with the reality that normal doesn't seem anywhere close in sight. And so we're talking about it. What do we do with it? What does the Bible say about it? What does God say about it? And how do we move forward the best we can? But this series, we've been having a lot of fun in the beginning of service and throughout the service with some short little films, kind of office-like films that have been pretty funny. Our team did a great job creating some entertainment there. But we also, this weekend, we played a version of the theme song to the show Cheers. And so we were laughing a little bit off camera because Cheers is not a new sitcom, and sitcoms in general aren't necessarily as popular as they once were. But before we get into that, Ben, Marna, welcome. Thanks for being here with us today, guys. But seriously, what is your favorite sitcom? Do you have a sitcom? Do you like Cheers? What do you think of Cheers?
I did. Cheers was one of my favorites growing up. So growing up, I grew up going to church, and we would go every Wednesday evening, and I would be adamant, we have to be home by 8 o'clock because Cheers comes on, and then at 8:30, and it could be 9. I think it was 8 and 8:30. Then 8:30, Night Court came on, which was another sitcom.
Man, you're right.
Sorry about it. So that was the Thursday was the night. No, it was a Wednesday. Whatever. I mean, Cheers and Night Court. That was my thing.
What's Night Court?
I love watching that.
What does that mean?
Night Court. It's about this judge who's a city judge at the courthouse, and it's just the lowest level of the court system where these guys would come in. And I don't know. It was good.
Was it like a reality show? Was it?
Oh no, it was a sitcom. Yeah, not a real one.
Okay. Well,
reality TV was not a thing back then.
Because I'm a millennial, and that's what I grew up on, which is hilarious. So Cheers and would you say Night Court? Was that what it was? Everybody listening over the age, how does this kid not know what this means? I know what Cheers is, but Night Court's, that's new for me. Marna, you done making fun of me over there?
No, it was so much fun to watch. You're just I'm sorry, what? First of all, a sitcom, we don't even call them that anymore. The whole thing, even in talking with my kids, where you would be you had to be home at a certain time because you missed it. It wasn't like you could go back and watch it. You'd have to wait till summer when they played repeats.
They played the reruns.
It was funny just even thinking through what we're so used to now, and the difference in some of that. So I was honestly, Casey, it was so much fun for me to be a fly on the wall listening to you too, because I was oh my gosh, this is amazing. So I would say Family Ties was definitely my favorite. I know Ben and I kind of come from that same space, but I mean, we did not miss that show. So that was my favorite, but yeah.
So Family Ties, that's the one where the guy adopts the two kids. Am I right in that one?
No, Family Ties was
Different Strokes.
That was different.
Oh, that one, yeah.
That was a good one too, though.
Family Ties was Alex P. Keaton, and that was Michael J. Fox. That was his big breakout show. Yeah.
Michael J. Fox.
You got it.
I know that guy.
There you go. You at least know back in movies. Yeah.
Right. Cheers. Cheers. You guys were making fun of me earlier because I was is that the Fonzie guy with the leather jacket?
The look on our face was the best. We're the mailman? Did the main character I can't we were trying to put that whole thing together, so it's amazing.
Happy Days, just for anybody wondering, that's where the Fonz is from, is Happy Days.
Yes.
You did look that one up. That's good. Well, yeah, you're right, because sitcoms aren't really a thing anymore. In a way, they've kind of ended, or maybe transitioned. Right now we watch Netflix, we watch YouTube. It was funny, Martin, you were saying if I missed a show I'm like, what do you mean miss the show? Like, I just go look it up on YouTube and watch it, or just try and.
Right.
Yeah. Like that's what I was saying to my kids, like, no, you didn't have the internet. Like you have to so none of that. Like they were just like, I mean, like they got it, but it's like, wait, what? Like you couldn't even,
At
sort
one
of.
point, like they came out with the VCR, of course, and you could record
Oh, that's
on
right.
a VCR cassette tape. The big tape you would put in,
Yeah.
you would record it, and then you could set. This was like super hard to do, by the way. Like you could set it to start recording at a certain time. So if you were gone, you could come home and then watch it on the VCR. And like 90% of the time, it just didn't work. So you get home and you're like, oh, it never recorded. And then you're just done. Like you missed a football game, you missed.
It's like the original DVR. I had some friends growing up who used to do that all the time, and they had like every season of Lost on like VHS. Like, what in the world are you gonna do with that now? Like, oh my gosh. Oh man, it's interesting because I think even as we have this conversation, what we're finding is as time goes on, like things end. Like things don't last forever. They just don't. And as much as we would want them to, like we can't go back in time and make things like they used to be. Like things are constantly changing. And so this weekend, as we even talk about like where's norm, it's like, well, old normal's gone and new normal is going to come. And so I think that's an easy thing to say, like that's gone, something's new, but there's the space in between. There's the transition, there's the ending. And so this weekend we stepped into a conversation all about that. In fact, as a church, we've been going through transition over the past 5 or so years as we went from one lead pastor who started a church, who created a movement in Northwest Ohio that was unlike any other church that had ever been here, to a young leader who was a little bit different in his leadership style, who different in his communicating style, which is not bad things, but it's just different. And so we've been navigating all of this transition with the help of a book and an author, a book called Transition by William Bridges. And his premise is that we better navigate new changes and uncertainty when we understand the journey of transition. Because here's the reality. We usually go from where we used to be to where we are, and we forget that there's all this transition in between. And so he talks a little bit about some concepts and some principles in the midst of it, but I don't want to give it all away. I'd love to pass it to you guys. But I have a question a little bit, like as a member of Cedar Creek, what's something that you feel like has been most difficult in the midst of transition, or even what could have been easy to ignore or not even realize in the midst of a transition as of a lead pastor, maybe something you guys have experienced in your life before?
No, I think back to even at the time that Ben was really put in place to leave Cedar Creek, it was almost as if at that point it was like, okay, well, we've got a new lead pastor and here we go. So, I mean, there was like that collective, like, who's it going to be? Sort of, you wanted the answer because you figured that would get you to the new beginning. Like now, looking back on it with Williams, with that, did I say his name right? I'm having a sudden okay. So with his model in place, that I think, wow. And I was in that crowd. I mean, I was very much in a place of like, okay, well now we know, and we can sort of get on with it, not really realizing all the things that come with that are in many ways, like you said, are changes and ultimately are endings that lead to new beginnings. So so while we look for the one big change, the process is incredible. And I love how you said that. We've been in the midst of it for a while as a part of staff. Really, anybody who's been a part of our church has been a part of it. They may not have realized it or said it that way, but man, there is something really powerful about understanding this model of transition and how that impacts us emotionally, spiritually, and the ways that we can start thinking about change. So that's what I loved about, Ben said, can we change the way we think about change? And it's not that people don't like change. In some ways, we sort of relish in it. It's usually the transition that we don't like. We're ready to get to the new beginning. It's like, let's blow past the rest of this stuff. So how about you, Ben?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think when I always feel like I'm good with change, but just talking about it and listening to that, Ben speak this weekend, I like to blow through it. Like that transition, like I skip it. Which he talks about healthy endings, and there's probably a lot of the health that I skip, and I go right to the new thing, which we'll talk about a little bit later, isn't always healthy. But like for me, when we transitioned from Lee Powell to Ben, like I left for about a year and a half to help start a church up in Ann Arbor. So that was a change for me. But like all my effort was in like, hey, we're getting this new church started, up and running. So like it was all about the new beginning. Like I didn't have time to think about what I had left behind. And then after that, a year and a half, I came back, and it was the same exact thing. Like I, was stepping into something new back here at Cedar Creek, which was still in the transition, really. So yeah, I'll go from one thing to the next and just focus everything on what's ahead and leave behind what's behind. So to think about it as a transition, and that there is a way to have healthy endings, that was something I probably could have benefited from in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in order for us to step into this conversation, like Ben said, and Martin repeated it, we have to change the way we think about change. So instead of seeing it as something to blow through or just get by or figure out the end result, let's change our perspective and see like what can happen in the midst of transition, what can happen to us in the midst of change. Because here's the thing that happens, and I think we've all realized this, even if we blow through it, we realize we're struggling with the ending. We look at the ending of what we just had to end, or we look at the reality of what we just had to end, and it may not sit well with us. There may actually have to be, we'll talk about later, something we have to do in the midst of it to work through it. But I guess like what are the signs, and talk through a little bit of what Ben talked through this weekend, where we see ourselves struggling with an ending, and obviously being in the midst of this pandemic as well, like there's a lot of endings going on. So for you guys, where have you seen that happen maybe in your life?
Yeah, that's a loaded question, Casey. I loved his 3 indicators. So let's see if I have them. I know that criticism was one of them. Comparison was the second. And I think the third was catastrophizing, which that word does not roll off the tongue for me. But there is, I think that goes to show you sort of sometimes it's all 3, sometimes it's just 1 or 2 of them. And the reality is that knowing that, you can almost recognize when you're either stuck in something and haven't recognized the ending. It might be an indicator that you've gone through you're going through an ending, or something has to end. Like you might be coming up on an ending, because that's some of the thing with change is sometimes we initiate the change. Like you talked about, Ben, like you went to Ann Arbor. That was a change that you initiated. Other times there's changes that happen to us. We don't have an option. We lose our jobs, or we have to move for some reason, and certainly we think about this more and I think we talk about it more when it comes to losing someone that we love, like a death always brings about all of this conversation about grief. But when it comes to the other changes in our life, it's like, and we're off, So I love those 3 indicators, because it even caused me, like you said, Casey, to kind of take a step back, like, man, what is happening for me in the midst of this, and to the people around me? Probably for me, it's the easiest to kind of go to criticizing, or getting into space where it's like there's just a black and white and here's how it's going to be, and that's how I create sort of a safer place for an ending to happen. But I don't know, I can't say that there hasn't been moments for me of all 3 of those in the midst of this pandemic, for sure. So how about you, Ben?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about those things that I like to see an ending to, and I almost wrote about this in the Living It Out piece I wrote. I'm like, what do I love when it ends? Like a bad movie. Then I haven't been to a movie for a long time, but I remember like going to a movie theater and being like, this is the worst movie. Do I need to walk out? And when it ends, you're like, yes. Like going to the dentist, like when they're like, okay, all done, great ending. Like there's things that we love ending, but then like there's other things that are horrible, that are a struggle. And those are the things that we want to blow by and forget, like just put it under the rug, move on to the next thing. And sometimes we're able to do that pretty well, but you're right, those indicators of, wow, I find myself comparing a lot or criticizing, and that's a great, like, okay, when you see yourself doing that, then you can really realize, okay, maybe I'm struggling with an ending that I didn't even realize was an issue. So I thought those indicators were super helpful and healthy, for me when I blow by things, to like, when those are present, be like, okay, well, why are those present? What's is it just my personality, or is there something else more going on? Which usually it is.
Yeah, as you guys are talking, what's interesting to me is, I think oftentimes if we're not in a healthy place, we're not going to be able to identify the places where we're comparing, or we're criticizing, or we're catastrophizing things. And so I think what's so important, and as I think about what's like starting a couple of groups, like having people in your life point out where you have that. And I'll quick little digression here for me. I lead a group of students. I'm the central director of students at Cedar Creek, so I love my job. But I also lead a group because I know how important it is to be in community. I know how important it is for high school students to have friends and have a leader they can look up to. And so, like for me, that's convicting. I've been doing it since they were in 8th grade. And last night we had an incredible discussion. We watched a quick talk by a pastor named Mike Todd, and we just engaged some really, really good conversation. And it ended with the conversation around accountability. And accountability is a buzzword in church world because usually it's around sex. Like for some reason, that's what we always associate it with, is like accountability and sex, which is great. But it has to do with like your life and well-being in general. And so as I think about like, how do I identify as I'm starting to compare myself to other people, or criticizing everything I see, or catastrophizing everything happening around me, and how do I even know that that's because of change happening in my life? You've got to surround yourself with people that are holding you accountable, that you have granted permission and said, hey, I want you to speak into my life when you see me going down these paths, or hey, I'm entering into a season of change, or I'm in the midst of a pandemic right now and my job's really hard, or I don't know what to do with school. You got to be open. You got to be honest with people, because there's really, I don't know about you guys, but I find it really hard to identify those areas in my life by myself, especially when I'm in the midst of them, because there's no way I'm going to admit to being critical of the things around me as I'm being critical of the things around me. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's what's interesting for me about like, especially with accountability pieces. Like, well, for me, I think it's also that when we have an opportunity to be really honest, God really works in that. And so sometimes I feel like it's within that community that he just shows us those things, that it's something that somebody else says, and it's not necessarily a group that's sitting around like, okay, Casey, accountability time. Pretty sure you're criticized, but it's just through the natural work of that group and that communication that all of a sudden you're like, oh, I have really been critical lately. Like I'm honestly, as a group leader, I swear to all of you, it is the most fantastic experience to lead a group, because you just grow so much through that. And I find myself, when I'm saying to my group, like, God's going to work through this. When you're honest and are vulnerable and take off the mask, he just will show you. And so that, I think, has been the experience too, where you can trust that space for it to happen too. So I just love how you stepped into that, and that those environments allow God to work in ways that are sort of hard to put our finger on until, like, and I probably need to get, of all people, I should probably get better at actually articulating that. But I just think he does some special work in the midst of those communities.
Yeah, that's great. I think as you're stepping into, like, I mean, a lot of us recognize the moment change maybe starts, or that it's coming up. So like, if you know, hey, I have a season of change coming up, or whatever, I think being equipped with these things as well, like you can say to those people in your group, or to your spouse or whatever, like, hey, I realize I've got some change coming up, or we're going to be going through some change. So, let's just look and see, are we being critics? Are we comparing? Are we catastrophizing? So like, when it comes up, we're like, oh, there it is. Let's talk about it, or let's talk about that change, or how you're doing with it. I think it just kind of like, one, it can equip us on the back end, but I think if we go into change knowing about these three things too, then it can equip us to have good conversations about, okay, how are you struggling with it?
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, I think giving this language is so helpful, even as you're talking with people that are in your life, as you're listening. I think to give permission to somebody to speak into that life. And Martin is right. It doesn't have to be we're all sitting around going, you did this. Like it's not helpful. For me, honestly, it's a friend that I have that just sends me a text and says, hey, I noticed this. You doing all right? Like it's that simple. And it comes from a place of love too. And I know it's not what we're talking about today, but I think this relates to that so much, because to be able to identify how you're dealing with the change happening around you, you need people. Like you just need it. And I know, like no matter, I work at a church, like I lead people spiritually, and I struggled hard in this season. And it was because there's a lot of change happening. I think all of us are in some way. So as we get close to the group semester starting, I think there's no better place to be processing what it looks like to deal with endings than being in a group. So I'd encourage you to be stepping into there. And also a question to be thinking about too right now, even as you're in this space, is which one of those three is your go-to? How do you respond to the change happening around you? Is it comparing? Is it criticizing? Is it catastrophizing? I mean, that's a great question to be asking yourself right now, even as we talk about this. And I think to take a step out of like, okay, living it out, right? Like, how do we live this out? We can identify the problems, but if we just stir in the problems, then we don't actually end up getting better and going where we want to go or where God wants us to go. And so we have to have the next step, which is why we call this the living it out. So Ben talked this weekend a little bit about how healthy endings have three pieces to them. And I'd love for you guys to talk through each of these real quick, but I'll name them. That's the first one. Name it. You got to name it. You got to name what it is that you're feeling, what you're identifying, what's the change you're experiencing. You got to grieve it, and then you have to release it. So from you guys, what does that look like for you? Or I mean, which one of those three is maybe the most difficult for you? Or maybe explain those a little bit too would be helpful.
Yeah, I think for me, it's kind of a process to name it. I'm not very good at putting my finger on why I'm feeling a certain way. My go-to instinct is like, I'm tired of talking about how I feel about stuff. Like, let's just get on with it, kind of thing. Those of you who are in Enneagram 1 might know a little bit of this space. Like, oh wait, I am feeling a certain way, and I'm not. Like, I probably should pay attention to that. So, I find the most difficult part of actually naming it and really getting to the place of like, oh, here's the ending. Once I get there, then I feel like I can kind of work better from there. But I really resonated with how that really has to be the first step, because otherwise I think I'll ignore the transition every time. It'll just leave me in those places where it's like, man, again, I said it. I just want to get on with it. I just want to whatever. So I have to journal, just spend a lot of like, be still kind of time to get myself to a place where I can name it. But I resonated a lot with those three steps, that within the ending itself, naming it, grieving it, and releasing it, then like this is where we're going to start to sound like, oh my gosh, is there like a process to all of this? But the reality is like there really is. And that's, I think, part of what so much richness can come out of that. That's so much growth can come out of that. But if we don't acknowledge those things, then a lot of times we're going to miss it. So for me, I think it's the name it part.
Yeah, I would say for me, it's probably, I'll say the grieve it part. I don't know, even over the last couple of years, I can think pretty quickly like what has ended, but like the grieving part, like, okay, just reflecting on it, what did I enjoy about it, or what did I love about those moments or that time, or like really reflecting on it. So there's certain things, throughout our life, things change and we have to give up whatever, to give up relationships or give up opportunities, and that's just kind of happens in our life as we move forward and God calls us to new things. But just really saying, okay, it's okay to remember them and to enjoy them and to like celebrate the years, but also to be okay, like, hey, that's not a part of my life anymore, or isn't what it used to be, but that's okay. I'm gonna enjoy and remember and have good thoughts about it, but I'm gonna also miss it, and that's okay to miss it and to know that it's no longer a part of my life. I think that can be difficult for sure.
Yeah, for sure. That's good thoughts from both of you guys. I think for those of you listening, I don't know what ending you're struggling with right now. I'm sure it's something, if you're a student, it might be school, maybe sports, if that's your reality. For some of you, it's not. For some of you, it is. for some of you who have kids and grandkids, and just the reality of what is happening in the world around us, and I think our individual endings too. Like there are endings happening around you all the time, and you might not even see it. And so my prayer for you is that you can see it and you can name it, because like Marna said, that sometimes is the hardest part. When you can step into it and name it, and then begin to grieve it, begin to say, you know what, it is sad, it is unfortunate, it is something that I can be upset about, and give yourself permission and give yourself the grace to eventually release it. And for me, that's typically one of the hardest parts too, is to let go and to move on, because as this series is showing, like we all miss norm, like we want what we used to have, but the reality is the world changes and things change, but the hopeful part is God stays the same, is that he is consistent throughout all of this, throughout change. The transition is necessary, is because as always, and like we always say, God is creating you. He's taking you along on this adventure to help you become the person that he's created you to be, and most oftentimes the person that you want to become as well. And so I would encourage you to keep leaning in. Join a group. If you are not in a group, I think lead a group, right? We've got group leader trainings. I know this weekend across our campuses, Marna, am I correct in saying they're different times across all of our campuses?
Yeah.
So Perrysburg at 9 a.m. So if you want to come to Perrysburg group training at 9 a.m., we'll be there. But it's super, super important for us to have so many groups, because the more groups we have, the more people can be engaging in real life conversation around these things. Do you guys have any thoughts about groups or any other dates that maybe you want to throw out there?
I just think for me, like if you are sitting and listening to this podcast and thinking that either a group didn't work for me, or I was part of that at one time, or whatever sort of obstacle that you put, I think what I would say is that it's super important for us to recognize sometimes that God's really calling us into a different place with that. And so if you haven't thought about leading a group, or you got restless in a group, or it ended, or whatever it is, I cannot encourage you enough to go to group leader training and just check it out. I think we've said it before, but like, we're not going to make you sign on the dotted line. It's not like, and now you have to. But I think we discount ourselves too often about what it looks like to lead a group. And honestly, like we can make the call to join a group, but unless we have group leaders and people who are willing to step into that space, and I think if you're listening to this podcast, that means that you're somebody who's kind of taken some steps and been on the adventure for a while. For me, it's just time to lead, and whatever that looks like. So I can't encourage you enough to at least just go to group leader training, hear what it's about, and see if it's a good fit for you.
Great. There are thousands of people who need to be connected in a group at our church. And that's not being dramatic. I mean, there are literally thousands of people who need to be connected in groups. And to be honest, I think a lot of them are just waiting on someone that maybe is you, someone like you, to start a group. I would encourage you, no matter who you are listening, just take a step into that. I think it can be a really, and Marna said it, God works in some of the most incredible ways when we're leading others and we're helping others take next steps along their journey. It's going to help your journey. So that's good. Well, cool, guys. Thanks for engaging in a really good, practical, I think helpful conversation as we all learn what it looks like to live in a new normal and move on from endings, because it's hard to do. So name it, grieve it, release it. I don't know what your next step is this week, but I'd encourage you to take one and invite someone else into that next step. Marna, Ben, thanks for being on. Appreciate you guys. Super fun conversation today. Hope you guys have a great week. And for those of you listening, have a great rest of your week. I hope you're reminded that you matter, and we'll see you next week. See you later.